This is the Marabou Minnow. It's a super easy fly to tie. It's really versatile. You can make it to where it sinks really, really deep, or you can make it to where it just kind of sits in the water column. I'm going to use a wacky worm hook. I use these mainly because they're inexpensive and they're really, really strong. I'm putting on a big, extra large bead, and that's because I want this fly to sink. It's summertime here in Central Texas, and during the day when the top water bite's not on, I'm going to be targeting bass and perch that are really deep. So that's what I'm using this fly primarily for. You're going to get any color of marabou feather. I only use one feather. I'm using white or tan here, and you can tie this in green or pink or white or orange, whatever. It works great, probably also as a saltwater fly. The next step is going to be to get some crystal flash. I've quartered my crystal flash, which is what I usually do for tails that aren't super long, which means that I have it, half it, and then half it again, making 4 strands. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 of the 4 strands, wrap them on either side of the marabou, and try and space them out as evenly as I can. Then I'm going to come in with the last 2 strands and put them kind of on the underneath side of the hook and then work them over. You can use your fingers to kind of manipulate the strands. You want them to be about the same length as the tips of the marabou feather. And the next step is to make a dubbing loop. So you're going to take some extra thread and pull 3 to 4 inches towards yourself while you're tying this. And then you're going to use this dubbing tool and place that loop into the V so that it separates the threads enough to where you can fit the dubbing in between the thread, if that makes sense. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to secure this bead because I want to hide the bead inside the dubbing loop that we're making so that it blends into the fur really, really well. I'm using like a blended rabbit's fur that's got a bunch of gray looking flashies in there, and really you should just go to a fly store with whatever marabou you've got and just go and browse the dubbing aisle. I really like the stuff that has natural fur that's blended with kind of the flashy synthetic stuff because it just looks super fishy and buggy depending on what fly you're trying to tie. I think this is the perfect type for this specific fly. So you're going to place all that dubbing into your loop, make sure it stays separated but has enough pressure on it to when you place each one, it's not going to fall out. And then you're going to spin it only in one direction. And then I'm using the rotary function on my vise to do this, but if you don't have that, you can also go around it with wraps. It's just a lot easier to use it with a rotary. You're going to make sure that, like for me, I probably put too much. Some people might scoff at this, like if you're looking at fly tiers who are professionals and don't want to waste material, but I like to put way too much dubbing on here because it's not really about how lightly this fly lands or anything else. It's really about the action and color and the profile. And so I put a ton of dubbing on there, and I'm going to use this really high-tech tool, which I call a scraper, that's essentially a clothespin stick with Velcro on it. And I'm going to brush all of the fibers against the grain from which I tied them in. So I'm going to do them towards the eye of the hook just to get them out. And then I'm actually going to brush them back the opposite way so that I got them maximum out of that dubbing loop without totally removing the fibers, if that makes sense. Then I'm going to tighten up the knot in the front a little bit to give it more form. And the way that you really finish the shape of this fly is going to be to add 2 more clumps. One on top, and you're going to tie it in the middle. Not a huge clump. And then you tie it in the middle, and then you pull the forward-facing part of that clump back over it. And then you're just going to repeat that process at the end where you're tying it in the middle. Loosely at first, you do 1 loose wrap, maybe 2 loose wraps. Then you tighten it up as you go. And then you pull it back. You want to make sure that you're not making too big of a thread dam behind the eye of the hook, and that's probably a mistake you'll make if you're newer. And you just kind of learn to get better at it. After you've tied several hundred flies, you always know to make sure to leave enough space behind the eye of the hook. And if you look at the fly now, I mean, this would catch fish as it is. You don't need to add colors with like markers or eyes or anything. This right here would probably catch fish in most bodies of water on planet Earth, as long as you had fish looking at it and you were retrieving it in a way that mimicked whatever bait fish they primarily eat. So we're going to go ahead and put on some 3D eyes. I think these are the 5mm ones. I always talk about how I never buy eyes, in particularly from fly shops, and that's because it's a really bad ROI. You can go on Amazon or Alibaba and buy like 500 or 1,000 of these for like 15 or 20 bucks. It's such a better value proposition than buying them at fly shops. I'll buy all my hooks and weights and other crucial items at fly shops, but save your money on the eyes. They're way too easy to make and mass produce overseas, so you get a way better deal that way. You have to be really careful when you're putting the glue on the dubbing so that your fingers don't get caught. I've got big sausage hands, and so that's always a challenge for me. But the good news is that even if you do get it stuck and it leaves a fingerprint, you can use UV resin or just more super glue to come in and cover those up so that they'll actually become pretty much invisible. It's crazy. When you put a little bit of resin on the eyes, and I'm just putting it here on after putting the glue, I'll put the resin on there to make everything stronger, make it look a little bit crisper. But putting resin on the eyes just makes them look amazing. It's like using MSG in food. So you're going to finish this thing off with the UV light, and there you go. You've got yourself a Marabou Minnow. Let me know what you think, and if you stay tuned, you'll get to see how I use this fly to catch some fish here on Lady Bird Lake. All right, so here we are on Lady Bird Lake, and I've slowed this footage down so you can see what this fly looks like when it's dry, and then here it is getting wet, and what the action kind of looks like when I'm stringing it along. I'm usually pulling this in pretty quickly once it's sunk, and I'm going to let it sink almost to the bottom of whatever body of water I'm fishing. Not always, but usually. That's what it looks like wet. It looks way better once it's got water in it than it does just as a dry fly. It has a ton of promise. So I cast next to this dock. I let it sink all the way to the bottom, and this is my first cast of the whole day on this fly. Catch this nice little perch, and I always feel like if you can let this thing sink and then retrieve it really, really quickly right next to whatever fish happen to be hanging out next to the structure you're targeting, you're just going to trigger an instant bite. And what you'll also feel, like I'm using a 3-weight rod on this, so it's a really, really lightweight, makes it a lot more fun to catch the smaller fish, and you'll feel it constantly getting nipped at when they hit the marabou. Like I missed a hook set just there, but you're constantly feeling it getting nipped at until it just gets inhaled by somebody. And so I like to fish these fallen trees right next to the shoreline. If you're more patient than I am, or maybe you can get some sinking line to fish it next to like bridge structure, you're absolutely going to catch things like crappie and even sometimes catfish if you're retrieving it in slow enough. But I catch a nice little bass here. This was the first bass on this fly, and look how fat his stomach is. He's been gobbling up all kinds of good stuff.
Thanks, bud.
But the cool thing about this fly is that you can pull it in really quick on the surface and get a bunch of fingerling bass. And if you're more patient, you can wait for it to get really, really deep, and that's where the bigger bass are. It'd have to be a little bit farther away from the edge of the water, maybe 15, 20 feet, because I feel like, at least in my experience, when I'm catching these smaller bass, they're hitting it right away. But if you want to target the bigger ones that are going to eat either the smaller bass, the perch, they're below them. And so you have to make sure that the small ones don't get it before the big ones do. And you could also just tie this fly in a larger variation on like a bass fishing hook instead of these tiny little wacky worm hooks. But you know, I catch big fish on small flies fairly regularly. When I say big fish, I mean 1, 2, 3 pound fish. But for the most part, you will catch mainly a ton of small fish. What do you think? Would you include this in your fly box? Do you think you could tie it better? Give me some feedback in the comments. I'd greatly appreciate it. Tight lines, and have a great day.